There are times in the story when the world seems to turn upside down. What was previously considered absurd becomes normal, and ideas that would be discarded in times of collective health are defended with almost religious fervor. Ordinary people, seemingly rational, begin to act strange, aggressively, or completely irrational. Common sense dissolves. The reality seems distorted, as if it were being observed by a cracked mirror. And suddenly, what seemed safe, predictable, reasonable, is no longer. This phenomenon, which confuses and scares, is known as collective psychosis. This is when an entire society loses contact with reality and plunges into a state of shared delirium. We are not talking about science fiction. It is not a script of dystopia. It's something that has happened, and that still happens, more often than we would like to admit. The story is full of collective outbreaks that cost lives, dignity, and whole generations. At times, it seems that the world gets sick, and this disease spreads like an invisible but deeply contagious virus. Collective psychosis does not need blood, nor explicit violence to settle in. It begins subtly, an idea that becomes unquestionable, an emotion that spreads faster than logic, a fear that silences reason. Suddenly, the absurdity becomes common sense. The question becomes a crime. Silence becomes complicity. It is easy to think that this only happens to others, with past societies, with distant peoples, with weak people. But is it really? What if collective madness is not an isolated phenomenon in time, but something that is constantly around humanity, waiting for the right context to emerge? What if we are living, without realizing it, one of these phases right now? Understanding how collective psychosis forms and how it destroys the discernment of an entire society is more than a historical curiosity. It is an urgent need, because no one is completely immune, not even you. Neither do I. Not anyone who lives in unstable times, under emotional pressures, bombarded by fear, misinformation, and isolation. Before pointing guilty or seeking solutions, you need to recognize the symptoms, realize what is out of place. See, with clean eyes, the moment when society begins to move away from reality and give itself a little by little to the collective madness. This is the first step, and maybe the hardest. Carl Jung, one of the greatest names in psychology of the 20th century, warned us to an enemy that is rarely recognized, the human being himself. In his studies, Jung stated that the greatest danger to civilization is not natural disasters, nor viruses, not even wars. What most threatens the future of humanity is its own mind, especially when this mind disconnects from consciousness, reason, and individual responsibility. Jung described this as a psychic epidemic, an outbreak of collective irrationality in which unconscious forces take control of the psyche and guide the behavior of whole crowds. Unlike a physical collapse, this epidemic does not destroy buildings but destroys values. It does not overthrow walls, but drops moral convictions, ethical criteria, and the very sense of reality. And when this happens on a large scale, the result is devastating. Gustave Le Bon, another thinker who deeply studied the behavior of the masses, said the crowds are not really thirsty. They prefer illusions that comfort them to truths that challenge them. And who offers them these illusions quickly becomes their leader. Those who try to unmask them become an enemy. This moral inversion is one of the pillars of collective psychosis. Delirium is not only accepted, it is celebrated. And the truth, as evident as it may be, becomes a threat to be eliminated. Jung saw this movement as a regression of the individual to the state of herd. In times of crisis, fear, or disorientation, many give up the autonomy of thought and are carried away by the power of the collective individual. Consciousness goes out, and instead emerges a primitive, impulsive, and destructive group mind. It is in this scenario that the irrational becomes a rule, not exception. The mind, which should be the anchor of sanity, becomes the tool of madness, but not by accident. Collective psychosis is not just a collapse, she is often an answer, a distorted way of dealing with anxiety, uncertainty, insecurity, and like every defense mechanism, It seems to protect, while actually destroys. Humanity carries within itself the ability to create civilizations and to destroy them. And what determines which side will prevail is not the strength of weapons or the wealth of countries, but the psychological state of their individuals. Jung knew that, and he warned us. Without inner vigilance, without critical awareness, the mind can become the greatest threat to freedom, dignity, and humanity itself. Collective psychosis does not arise out of nowhere. She does not suddenly explode as an unexpected disaster. It is built step by step in silence, in the cracks of the human mind and the emotional breaches of a society in crisis. To understand how an entire population can dive into delirium, it is first necessary to understand how psychosis is born within an individual. According to the studies of Silvano Arrietty, one of the main schizophrenia experts of the 20th century, the process begins with a flood of negative emotions, fear, anxiety, and panic. This extreme emotional state destabilizes the mind, making the individual vulnerable and unable to interpret events clearly. The world looks strange, confused, threatening. Nothing seems to make sense. The first phase of this process is panic. The person finds himself surrounded by events he cannot understand or control. Reality begins to seem distorted, but it still tries to resist, still seeks answers. When these answers do not come, or when the pain becomes unbearable, collapse occurs. It is at this moment that delirium enters the scene, not as an outbreak of disorder, but as an attempt to reorganization. Arrietty calls this second phase of psychotic insight. This is when the individual, in despair, begins to set up a new narrative for what he is living, an explanation that finally makes sense, even if he is completely disconnected from reality. This delusional explanation relieves fear, organizes inner chaos, and offers an illusion of control. The mind, instead of collapsing, reconstructs itself in a pathological way. Now, imagine this same process happening, not in one person but in millions, an entire society exposed to constant fears, prolonged uncertainties, real or invented threats. People, emotionally fragile, stop questioning. They want security, not lucidity. They want comfort, not analysis. And so, as in a domino effect, delirium spreads. A delirium that doesn't look crazy because it is shared. A delirium that, being everywhere, begins to seem true. This is the birth of mass psychosis, a state of collective emotional imbalance that finds refuge in illusory beliefs. Beliefs that comfort, even if they enslave. That organize, even if they distort. And the greater the fear, the greater the acceptance of these beliefs. The irrational is no longer exception. It becomes norm, law, rule of coexistence. This new reality, built from panic and supported by collective delusions, creates a parallel world. A world where to question is dangerous, thinking is deviation, and doubting is a crime. And it is at this point that mass psychosis is no longer a psychological phenomenon and becomes a social control tool. Mass psychosis is not an abstract theory. She has face, name, date. Human history is marked by episodes in which whole societies plunged into a state of collective delirium, and the consequences have always been the same: fear, persecution, violence, destruction. Looking at these moments carefully is essential to recognize the signs when they repeat themselves, even under new guise. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, Europe was taken by a wave of hysteria known as witch hunt. Thousands of people, mostly women, were accused, tortured, and executed by alleged covenants with the devil. There was no evidence, there was no logic. There was fear, fueled by religious leaders and civil authorities. There was a desperate desire to find culprits for the tragedies of the time: pests, dry disasters. The wife of the village, the midwife, the lone widow became easy targets. Society, taken by panic, sacrificed its own members to maintain an illusion of order. This is one of the most cruel portraits of collective psychosis, when delirium becomes official politics and fear is organized as an institution. The same pattern would be repeated centuries later, with different contours. but with the same essence in the 20th century, with the emergence of totalitarian regimes. Nazism, Stalinism, and other forms of dictatorship were not only imposed by force, they were supported by entire masses that they believed with blind conviction in absolutely delirious ideas. Ideas that transformed integer groups into enemies to be eliminated. Ideas that demanded unrestricted obedience and justified any atrocity in the name of a supposed national salvation. These ideologies have grown in fertile soils, fragile populations, frightened, lacking in meaning and direction. And as Hannah Arendt taught, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, totalitarianism does not arise. Where there is thought, he is born where the thought was abandoned, where existential emptiness finds an ideology strong enough to fill it. The scary is that within these systems, the absurdity becomes everyday. The lie becomes sacred, the necessary violence. And those who refuse to enter this macabre theater are silent, banned, or destroyed. Society, once in psychosis, does not accept dissidents. She needs unanimity to maintain her illusion alive. These historical examples are not distant. Warnings. They are mirrors. They show what happens when collective fear becomes official truth, when the search for security overcomes love for freedom, and when reason surrenders to the comfort of a shared lie. Mass psychosis is not just something that happened, it is something that can happen again, and perhaps it's already happening. When a society begins to dive into collective delusions, there is always an inevitable question. This happens by chance, or is it provoked? The answer, unfortunately, is disturbing. Often mass psychosis not only emerges spontaneously, it is encouraged, cultivated, explored. There is a name for this process: lying, a systematic murder of the mind. Just Merleau, a psychiatrist who studied the mechanisms of brainwashing and psychological control in totalitarian regimes, defined lie as a method of mental manipulation capable of destroying the ability to think independently. It does not depend on weapons, but narratives, not of prisons, but of advertising. It is a slow, constant psychological, and precisely more difficult to understand. It all starts with fear. The human mind, on a state of extreme alert, becomes malleable, suggestible, dependent. Fear is the ideal terrain for the cultivation of delirium. Therefore, totalitarian systems invest both in the creation of constant crises, successive waves of terror interspersed with periods of illusory calm. Each new fright comes stronger because the mind has not yet recovered from the previous one. Moral is wearing out, judgment weakens, hope gives way to obedience. Advertising enters as a precision tool in this process. It not only conveys ideas, it rebuilds reality. And when well made, it makes the absurd look logical and the resistance seems crazy. But it is not a common advertising. It is a confusing, contradictory, fragmented propaganda made to paralyze reason. When data contradicts, when speeches change without explanation, when truths are adapted according to convenience, the mind loses its axis. The logic does not find ground to establish itself, and despair increases the emotional dependence of authority figures. Merleau observed something unsettling. Logic can be confronted with logic, but the illogical confuses even the most rational, and it is exactly this confusion that transforms an entire society hostage to madness. When everything looks uncertain, those who scream louder seem safer. When everything is ambiguous, the clarity of the tyrant becomes comforting. This process does not require brute strength. It requires time, repetition, and isolation. The mind, when disoriented and lonely, seeks shelter. And it is this shelter that psychosis engineers offer, with promises of safety, stability, and salvation. But the price is high. The freedom to think, the autonomy of judging, the ability to say no. Lying is invisible because it disguises themselves with normality. He does not command you to obey. He makes it seem that obeying is the only wise way. And when this happens, the individual does not realize that his mind has been kidnapped. He believes he is choosing, when, in fact, it is just repeating. Few things weaken both the human mind and isolation. Disconnected from affective bonds, without the support of friends, family, or communities, the individual becomes more vulnerable to fear, manipulation, and especially delirium. Isolation is not just loneliness, it is the rupture of the channels that help us maintain sanity. Perspective, the sense of shared reality. This is why isolation has always been one of the most effective tools for totalitarian regimes. Hannah Arendt and Just Merleau, in their studies on the psychological functioning of these systems, have noted that isolation is not a side effect. It is an essential part of the strategy. It not only prevents resistance organization, but weakens each individual's internal defenses. When we are together, we exchange ideas, let us vent, test our thoughts in conversation with each other. Dialogue, even in its simplest form, acts as a kind of mirror that helps us see distortions, exaggerations, misconceptions. But when this mirror is removed, when each one is left alone with their fears and doubts, the space for delirium grows. Merleau compares this process to animal conditioning. He cites Pavlov's experiments, in which conditioned reflexes were more effectively established in silent and controlled environments. Similarly, the human being, when isolated and subjected to repetitive stimuli, becomes more malleable, more obedient, more likely to accept the unacceptable. Social networks, while connecting billions of people, are not immune to this effect. On the contrary, they create bubbles, algorithms that reinforce beliefs, informative silos that exclude the diversity of thought. Instead of promoting real connection, they often expand the feeling of alienation and reinforce the worldview manufactured by those who control narratives. And the more time we spend in these environments, the more we lose contact with the real world experience, with the complexity, the contradictory, the human. The emotional and intellectual isolation that settles in this context creates a more vulnerable population to lie. With no healthy external references, the individual becomes easy prey to ready-made speeches, simplistic solutions, and authoritarian leaders. The absence of dialogue becomes complicit silence. And silence in this case is more dangerous than lies. Rescuing human ties, authentic conversations, spaces of coexistence and listening is a form of resistance. It is through the relationship with each other that we meet our critical sense, that we see again, beyond fear, which we remember who we are. When a society begins to isolate its members, physical, emotional, or ideologically, it is, consciously or not, preparing to descend the steps of collective psychosis. And perhaps the most urgent antidote is exactly this. We connect ourselves. Faced with mass psychosis, the first reaction of many is despair. After all, what to do when the whole world seems to have crazy? When the logic no longer has place, is the truth distorted and freedom begins to disappear disguised security? The answer is not simple, but it begins at an essential point, within each of us. The resistance to collective madness begins with the internal order. A disorganized mind cannot see clearly, much less fight forces that act invisibly and subtly. Therefore, the first step is constant vigilance about our own thoughts, emotions, and reactions. Be aware of the triggers of fear, the impulses of the flock, the desire for immediate comfort. Be aware that freedom requires effort, especially freedom to think. Next comes the action, to spread real, true, grounded information. Advertising and misinformation gain strength when voices that speak the truth are silent. So even in hostile environments, you need to keep talking. Not with aggressiveness, but firmly. Not with arrogance, but clearly. Even if it seems little, each mind is an extra link in the reconstruction of collective lucidity. But it is not enough just to argue. Laughter is also a weapon. Just Merleau highlighted the power of humor in the struggle against totalitarianism. Dictators and manipulators have laughter aversion because humor disarms fear and exposes the ridicule behind the tyranny. Humor reveals the emptiness of authoritarian narratives and returns to people the ability to see the absurd without having to face it directly and dangerously. Another powerful strategy lies in the creation of the so-called parallel structures. Václav Havel, dissident of the communist regime of Czechoslovakia, defended the construction of communities, institutions, and projects that, even living within a sick society, operate according to healthy values. These spaces, physical, digital, or symbolic, function as refuges of sanity, where freedom, truth, and human dignity still have room to breathe. These structures need not be grandiose. A room where you talk honestly, a group that shares information critically, an artistic project that values freedom. All of this are seeds of resistance. The more of these seeds they flourish, the more difficult it becomes for collective psychosis to dominate completely. And there are also individual choices. Protect your privacy, limit your exposure to advertising, cultivate critical thinking, empathize, maintain real human contact, stimulate dialogue with those who think differently. These attitudes, when repeated by many people, create cracks in the collective delirium system, cracks where the light comes in. Resisting is not a grand act. It is a series of small, conscious actions. It is keeping thinking when everyone has given up. It is keeping human in the midst of dehumanization. It is sustaining lucidity when it becomes dangerous. And above all, it is living so that its own existence is an act of rebellion against the absurd. History shows that societies dipped in collective psychosis are not saved with grandiose discourses, but with the silent lucidity of individuals who refuse the delirium. It is these rare and brave people who, when they keep faithful to the inner truth, light small outbreaks of sanity in an increasingly dark setting. It is not necessary to confront the mad mass directly, often just not accompany it. Albert Camus said that the only way to deal with a non-free world is to become absolutely free, so that his own existence is an act of rebellion. And this is exactly what is required of us in times like this, not just words, but presence. A lucid, full presence that inspires others to wake up. This struggle is not only political or social, it is deeply psychological and spiritual. It is about protecting the most sacred part of the human being, its ability to think, to feel, to choose. At a time when everyone is pressured to repeat others' ideas, keeping their consciousness intact is already a form of resistance. But that requires courage. Courage to think differently, to say no when the rest says yes, to maintain compassion even in the face of hatred, to laugh when everything seems tragic, to remain free, even if it means being alone. The world that succumbs to totalitarianism wants compliance, but true freedom is not born of obedience. It is born of conflict, doubt, conscious choice. There is no freedom without tension, and there is no lucidity without risk. Each person who chooses to live in an awakening way creates a resistance zone around him, and this zone, however small, can expand. Collective psychosis thrives in silence, passivity, repetition. Lucidity, on the contrary, blooms in the inner silence, but is expressed in the authenticity of the gesture, the firmness of the word, the boldness of presence. It is this lucidity that we must cultivate and protect as the most precious good of a society. The choice is, as it has always been, in the hands of each one. Submit to madness or stay whole, descend with the crowd or lift inside, surrender to darkness or being, even for a moment, the lighthouse that points out another way. As long as there is at least a lucid mind, there is hope, because where there is conscience, there is freedom, and where there is freedom, there is humanity. We live in delicate times when it is increasingly difficult to distinguish what is true from what manipulation is, but even in the face of confusion, it is still possible to choose. It is still possible to keep lucidity alive. Mass psychosis is not an inevitable destination. It only sets in when we give up thought, empathy, listening, and the courage to be free. May each of us, in their own way, be a point of resistance, a sign that not everything is lost, that there are still those who think, feel, question, that choose to remain human even when everything around asks the opposite. If this message made sense to you, enjoy the video. This helps spread this content to more people who, like you, feel that something is not right. Share with those who need to hear this, and subscribe to the channel to continue following reflections that challenge common sense and cause thought. And leave your comment. What have you been doing to keep your mind free in such chaotic times? Let's build this conversation together.